Okay, thank you very much for coming to the talk, and also thank you, Tyrus, for kindly accepting our invitation to give us this very precious talk. And let me first introduce our speaker, Tyrus Miller. Professor Miller is the Dean of the School of Humanities and also a professor of art history and English at University of California, Irvine. He is the author and editor of several books on modernism and the avant-garde, including Late Modernism, Politics, Fiction, and Arts Between the World Wars, Singular Examples, Artistic Politics, and the Neo-Avant-Garde, Modernism and the Frankfurt School, and Georg Lukács in Critical Theory, Aesthetics, History, Utopia. He edited the Cambridge Companion to Wyndham Lewis and has also edited and translated Georg Lukács' post-World War II essays in Hungarian, The Culture of Peoples, Democracy, Hungarian Essays on Literature, Art, and Democratic Transition, 1945 to 1948. And Professor Miller will speak on the subject remediating the future, meta-historical reflections on the avant-garde. And without further ado, let's welcome Professor Tyrus Miller, please.
Thank you. I'm very grateful and very honored to be asked to speak in this series. So I really appreciate the invitation and the occasion. I think I will turn on this sharing now for the slideshow. And is are the slides coming up?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, very good. So this paper focuses on two cases in the European avant-garde in which we can observe not only an active unsettling and reconstruction of specific artistic and cultural traditions, but also a more radical exploration of the very structural conditions in historical temporality of tradition. That is in the work of the Bauhaus artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and the German Dadaist Kurt Schwitters. More broadly, I want to frame my discussion of their work within a theoretical claim that the artistic avant-gardes ushered in a change in 20th century art that was not simply historical in nature, but meta-historical, a change in the basic presuppositions of historicizing European art and writing about it. The oeuvre of Hungarian artist and Bauhaus leader Laszlo Moholy-Nagy encompasses a vast diversity of media, including painting, graphic art, photography, photogram, photomontage, sculptural assemblage, kinetic sculpture, light projection, and film. In the increasing penetration of technology in the practice of art and design, and the immersion of experience in an environment technically shaped as what Moholy-Nagy called vision in motion, he discerned a mobilization of historical experience that unsettled the boundaries between past, present, and future, as history's material signs pass through successive technical remediations. Moholy-Nagy positioned his artistic work as a relay point in the present through which the future could reach back into the past and reconfigure it as a changeable repertory of material traces. I go on to discuss the work of the German collage artist Kurt Schwitters, whose work analogously attacks the ordering of time that underlies tradition and offers alternative measures of time. In his collages and writing, Schwitters invests apparent sequentiality with singular metrical differences, explores illogical successions within sequences, and illustrates the disruptive workings of the unruly, desiring body on sequence. Schwitters also disrupts time through intermittence and unexpected recurrence, especially in his prose work. He was also a polymathic artist, making collages, paintings, typographical design, books, poetry, text of all sorts. Lastly, Schwitters revises the idea of artistic consequence as it is used, for instance, in narrative or in musical form. Schwitters replaces the notion of consequentiality as realization in successive time intervals of an anticipated effort with an alternative notion of consequence as determined by relevance, the metrics of which are multiple, qualitative, and overdetermined. In their artistic works and thought, both Moholy-Nagy and Schwitters offer alternative models for a contemporary appropriation of the past that emphasizes complexity, remediation, and freedom from traditional authority, while not being merely ahistorically futuristic. This basic theoretical idea was advanced by Peter Berger in his classic Theory of the Avant-Garde already in 1974, though it was a relatively little noticed theme in the extensive discussions and debates around Berger's book in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But I'll quote a key passage in which Berger claimed in so many words that despite the failure of the European avant-gardes to realize their utopian goal of transforming life through a radicalized art, they did succeed in the more limited goal of destroying a certain conceptual basis of art history conceived as a historical succession of styles. And Berger writes, whether the break with tradition that the historical avant-garde movements brought about has not rendered irrelevant all talk about the historical level of artistic techniques practiced today is something to be carefully thought about. The availability of and mastery over artistic techniques of past epochs owed to the avant-garde movements make it virtually impossible to determine a historical level of artistic procedures. Through the avant-garde movements, the historical succession of techniques and styles has been transformed into a simultaneity of the radically disparate. The consequence is that no movement in the arts today can legitimately claim to be more historically advanced as art than any other. An analogous argument would be advanced by the author, Berger, by the author Arthur Danto in his 1997 book, After the End of Art, Contemporary Art and the Pale of History, in which Danto argues that the artworks of what he calls the age of the manifestos, meaning the period of the classical avant-garde, the 1910s, the 1920s, were typically supported by a philosophical theory of art and, quote, a slanted rereading of the history of art as the history of the discovery of that philosophical truth. By the mid-1960s, Danto argued, it had become clear that, quote, the deep truth of the historical present lies in the age of manifestos being over, because the underlying premise of manifesto-driven art is philosophically indefensible. A manifesto singles out the art it justifies as the true and only art, as if the movement it expresses had made the philosophical discovery of what art essentially is. But the true philosophical discovery, I think, is that there really is no art more true than any other, and there is no one way that art has to be. All art is equally and indifferently art. What Danto does not really emphasize, but what Berger strongly asserts, is that it is precisely the activity of the avant-gardes during the age of manifestos that brings art to this point of giving up any vocation of defining philosophically what art essentially is or must be like in order to be authentically modern or of its age or advanced avant-garde. The proliferating strings of strong, exclusive, but conflictual claims that the avant-gardes put forward about why their particular movement was the essential art of the age, and their construction of art historical narratives to justify these claims leads instead, in the latter half of the 20th century, to the recognition that this conflict is irresolvable. Both Berger and Danto thus suggest that one of the unwitting outcomes of the avant-garde is that they usher in, against their will, a relativism in the arts that can no longer support an avant-garde or its age of manifestos. There is, however, a strongly retrospective aspect to both Berger and Danto's arguments. Only when the avant-gardes are no longer actual, when they have passed into history, and after all, we're 100 years or more after that first upsurge of the avant-garde, when they passed into history, only then does the open-ended relativism of contemporary art become available. Berger greets this somewhat somberly, while Danto thinks that art is liberated to pursue its pluralistic projects, lightened of the burden of carrying some essentially philosophical historical truth, as well as giving itself to viewers contingently to provoke pleasure and thought. I want to question this retrospective perspective, however, and raise the question about whether, at least in the case of certain artists of the avant-garde, we don't see such pluralistic implications emerging already in the age of manifestos, not after it and as a function of its closure. In exploring this hypothesis, I will consider in some detail and with visual and textual examples the work of the Bauhaus artist and theorist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and the polymathic artist Kurt Schwitters, who is most closely associated with Dadaism, but like Moholy-Nagy was a restless experimentalist and multimedial explorer of different modes of art. So part one, I'll deal with Moholy-Nagy, and I'll specifically be focusing on his ideas about photography, film, the modernization of visual experience under the influence of technology, and also in a more conceptual turn, the implications of his thought about the mobilization of vision and technical reproduction for the historical transmittability of tradition. To bring these two elements together, the idea of a mobilized perception of vision in motion, as he put it, and the integral role of technology in this mobilization of perception, I would offer the following summary. Moholy-Nagy understands technically mobilized vision to be not only reshaping modern humanity's relation to space, but also through the analogous technical mobilization of the traces of the past and present, also reshaping our relation to time and history. Just as Moholy-Nagy speaks of a technical morphosis of space, we can also see in his work a technical remediation of tradition in ways that require us to imagine a technologically reshaped relation to the past and present. Moholy-Nagy does at times affirm a kind of progress in the arts that is measured by the exploration of new media and technologies that allow new forms of expression to come into being. But he also sees the specific operations of such technology as leading to a kind of horizontal spreading of new relations, interactions, and possibilities, such that any progressive narrative of development is called in question. To use Berger's term, any progressive succession of techniques and styles based in new technologies and their possibilities gives way in Moholy-Nagy's thought and practice to a simultaneity of the radically disparate. The logic of his artistic activities cannot be contained by progressive selection and succession, but rather instances and open-ended differentiation and accumulation of instances that proliferate across media and across a vast range of possibilities. It is this latter mode that truly marks Moholy-Nagy's work, with a restless experimentalism and an embrace of an extraordinary range of media, modes, and materials. To give you a sense of his work, I'd like to consider an unrealized film scenario called Dynamics of the Metropolis that Moholy-Nagy first published in his native Hungarian language in the September 15th, 1924 issue of the avant-garde journal Ma, Today, edited in exile in Vienna by the poet and artist Lajos Kossuth. Mahoy Nagy subsequently published a significantly different German language version in his book Malerei, Fotografie, Film, Painting, Photography, Film, in the Bauhaus book series in 1925. I'll begin with the Hungarian version. I'd first note that it appears in a special issue of Ma dedicated not to film or photography, but to music and theater. It includes text on performance, including the futurists Marinetti and Prampolini on futurist theater, Schwitters on the Merz stage, the Märzbühne, Elizitsky's presentation of an electromechanical performance of the Russian futurist poet Klebnikov, Kruchenyek, and Malevich's futurist opera, Victory Over the Sun, which was accompanied by Liszitsky's famous portfolio of images. There's an essay by Soviet director and theorist Alexander Tyrov, an essay on the mechanization of music by the composer and musicologist H.H. Stuckenschmidt, and other text and images related to avant-garde performance. Thus, while Mahoy Nagy's text is clearly labeled as a film sketch, the context it presents itself in is as a performance work. Implicitly, too, the typography maps the letters, words, symbols, and image onto the page in as a kind of virtual stage. Mahoy Nagy's scripts makes also reference to the circus, which we'll see, ending in a kind of circular space and an alternation of clowns and lions. This is the reference to the circus is at the bottom and the circle. And in the German version, we can see, this elephant, lions, clowns, the trapeze, girls, legs, clowns, and so forth. So this is a page dedicated to the circus. So again, a kind of performative dimension of the film script. As noted, the German version recontextualizes the Hungarian text by placing it in a visual and technological media framework of painting, photography, and film, as Mahoy Nagy's book is titled. Unlike the arrangement in the journal Ma, where the large-scale square format is divided into 3 regular columns, across which the different elements create pushes and pulls along the diagonals according to a multiplicity of perceptual and semiotic criteria, like word versus graphic, small versus large, discrete versus aggregate, letter versus visual sign, circular versus rectangular shape. The German version, in contrast, is vertically and horizontally gridded in an arrangement clearly influenced by the Dutch periodical De Stijl, so more constructivist, more abstract in its kind of formation. And it creates the implication of spatialized zones in which events and objects are appearing in overlapping relations of simultaneity and phase transition. The German edition incorporates photographic images, giving a more filmic look to the text, and even in some places suggesting strips of films and film stills as an editor might view them on a light table. Its pages are less densely packed than in Ma, which means too that the film scenario takes up a full 14 pages of the book. Thus, turning the pages of the book also gives a tactile impression of progressive movement, sequence, and the unfolding of experiences, rather than Ma's version, the overwhelming sense of immersion in the chaotic simultaneity of metropolitan sights and sounds. And in addition, the Hungarian edition contains a set of explanatory remarks at the end, after where you see Vega. Everything that follows that is a set of explanatory remarks to aid the reader's comprehension of Mahoy Nagy's composition. In the German edition, these are substantially reduced and incorporated as expository text side by side with the images and descriptions that are in the film text. One of the most interesting variations of the two versions involves the opening sequence, in which a set of linear forms compose themselves via film animation into a metal construction before the reader's eyes. This is a self-reflexive allegory of filmmaking itself, in which the elemental pieces of a technology-saturated metropolitan space compose themselves into a piece of complex machinery that itself extends the work of construction or mobilization. In the Hungarian version, the machine constructed is a steel crane, which Mihály Nagy emphasizes is used for building houses as it moves up and down and in circles. In the German version, in contrast, Mihály Nagy offers a photograph instead of the hand-drawn sequence implying the animation cells, and now his note indicates that the animated film is to compose a set of points and lines into a totality that transforms into a photograph of the construction of a Zeppelin, thus also shifting the technological thematics from that of machine construction to a technology that mobilizes, accelerates, and elevates human embodiment and perception. The significance of this revision at the very outset of this programmatically important film sketch constitutes, I believe, a critical point to underscore. In both versions, Mihály Nagy implies a continuity between machine technologies in the larger environment and the media technologies of registration and reproduction. Both are expressions of technological modernization in the englobing life world of the metropolis. However, the revision imposes a shift of emphasis with notable theoretical implications. If in the Hungarian version, the emphasis falls on the artist as constructor, and hence on the montage work of the film editor as creating new relations of contiguity and connection, like the technologizing of dwelling in house construction. In the German version, the role of the artist and of his technological medium is reconceived. Here, the emphasis falls on the overall role of technologies, and particularly technologies of movement, technologies of transportation and communication, and therefore in mobilizing perception. Reproductive media technologies, and most importantly film, are now cast less as constructive machinery and more as communication and transportation in virtual space, as one further instrument of the generalized mobilization of perception. Moreover, it might be said that the object of Mihály Nagy's film script is no longer the machine itself, but the perceptual environment that includes the technological shaping of both external space and vision, the immanent dynamic dimension of experience in which materials, biological functions, and various technologies intertwine and interact. Notably, this was the key message that the architectural historian Siegfried Giedion also influenced in his influential book, Building in France, in which the weightless structures of modern architecture, facilitated by ferroconcrete and steel materials, lift images from the city view and mobilize them in new patterns and constellations. Architectural solidity is dematerialized into mobile views and the play of shadow, light, and shifting form. Mihály Nagy provided the photo montage for the book's jacket, and it found one of its most avid readers in Walter Benjamin as he worked up his history of 19th century Paris, the Passagenwerk. Although in this photo montage, we have returned to the crane with which Mihály Nagy began the Hungarian version of Dynamics of the Metropolis, the use of a photographic negative changes the meaning of this machine image. The implication now is that the mobile crane is seen as a stop in a dynamic trajectory, with a particular distribution of negative and positive spaces and of black-white shades on a gray scale. As it moves, these will change in an ever-shifting set of kaleidoscopic rearrangements. Despite its mechanical trajectory, its effect on perception is discontinuous, disparate, and differentiating. No longer a piece of constructive machinery, the crane has become a moving apparatus for a dynamic fracturing and reassemblage of visual experience. It has become, perhaps by implicit metonymy of the modern film studio, a completely literal part of a vast social cinematic apparatus. Yet it is also externally present in the industrialized metropolis, of which the film studio is only a limited and, if exemplary, part. Now, going a little bit deeper into the image of the crane, it appears as well in one of Moholy Nagy's essays on the new possibilities of sound and color for the film, so an essay from the 1930s. Moholy Nagy imagines a range of innovative filming techniques that mobilize the camera as well as the object film in order to greatly expand the range of perspectives, angles, speeds from which the dynamic interactions between camera and object can be orchestrated. And he writes, we must imagine a camera mounted on a crane able to move at will diagonally, vertically, or in a circle or a combination of these directions. With such a camera, it is possible to take continuous shots of any given scene from innumerable angles and constantly changing views from long shot to close-up. Instead of moving the camera, it is possible to move the object itself, for instance, a revolving stage, a conveyor belt. Again, it is possible to move the object and the camera. Both may move at the same speed and in the same direction, or at varying speeds and in different directions, thus providing the possibility for an infinite set of variations. Shots from swings, roundabouts, moving ships, and airplanes provide further opportunity for enriching the field of vision. So you can hear in this passage, he's running through a whole set of combinatorics about the relative relationship of the recording device and the object and the possibility of setting them in motion and setting them in relation to one another through their technological mediation. Notably, Moholy Nagy also suggests this conception of dynamic simultaneity in the optical realm has its corollary in the realm of sound as well. And he writes, just as it is possible to arrest an object visually in a great many different ways, from above or below, profile or full face, in normal perspective or foreshortened, similar possibilities must exist in regard to sound. There must be different sound angles, just as there are different angles of sight. Variously graded combinations of music, speech, and noise will be the main method of realizing these effects. In addition, there are numerous possibilities for acoustic close-ups, slow motion, the slowing down of sound, acceleration, sound contraction, distortion, duplication, and other methods of sound montage. Optical simultaneity must find its counterpart in the realm of sound. In short, Moholy Nagy evokes a vast range of new spatial morphologies made possible by coordinating the relative movement of the object or environment and the technological recording device of the camera. Now, Moholy Nagy's extension of this morphosis of space to the temporal dimension of history is somewhat less explicit in his writing, but we can get at this by remarking on two features of his work. First, Moholy Nagy was fascinated with new technical media associated with the registration and preservation of documentary information, including photography, film, and sound recording. And second, his exploration of artistic techniques that broke down in the use of these technical media the distinction between primary production and reproduction. Thus, in a fundamental essay that he published in the Dutch avant-garde journal De Stijl in 1922 that was entitled Production/Reproduction, he argues against using such media as photography and film solely to reproduce reality, and instead suggests that artists should use novel artistic techniques to produce, quote, new relations in the service of, quote, human construction. So a phonographic recording, he writes, An extension of this apparatus, the phonograph, for productive purposes could be achieved as follows. The grooves are incised by human agency into the wax plates without any external mechanical means, which then produce sound effects which would signify, without new instrument and without an orchestra, a fundamental innovation in sound production. And elsewhere, he even suggests that the idea that such inscriptive writing, for instance, on the soundtrack of a film strip, which at that time, had the soundtrack as a parallel to the image, that you could write directly on this. And in fact, he imagines a systematizing of it to become what he calls an acoustic alphabet of sound writing, in which we will eventually be able to write acoustic sequences on the soundtrack without having to record any real sound. I would suggest, in other words, that at this early moment, 1922, to remind you, Moholy-Nagy is already beginning to imagine possibilities within photography, film, and sound recording that have only recently been consummated by digital technologies such as Photoshop and AI creation of deepfake images and voice recordings, with all of the profoundly unsettling effects that such active interventions into the putatively documentary basis of the historical archive might entail. In other words, if you can basically create a apparently authentic photograph or other documentary means on an extensive basis and on an intensive basis, the question of how the archive will continue to function is one that I would suggest is already anticipated by Moholy-Nagy. He also notes how technological registration and manipulation of traces can disrupt the basis on which the transmission of tradition rests. But for Moholy-Nagy, such remediation of the past is a largely optimistic project. Through such mobilization and dynamization, exciting new relations between historical materials can be opened up and discovered, no longer reducible to the chronology and linear successive narrative. We might even say that if the registration and preservation of documentary traces in a chronologically locatable way is the underlying principle of the historical archive, Moholy-Nagy unsettles the archive's indexing of a historical trace to a definite moment in time. For in its technically produced or reproduced form, it can be duplicated, reiterated, spliced, and montaged with other disparate material, or even be produced in the first place unrelated to any prior historical event or reality. In the new archive that this technology promises, Moholy-Nagy thus evokes an open-ended simultaneity of disparate historicizing relations, but only a few of which would be recognizable within any disciplinary sense of history as conventionally historical. Okay, I'm going to pass on now to Švytas, and I start with a passage from Švytas where he writes, and here I'm going to really be focusing on the role of numbers and measure in Švytas. And I start with a quote from Švytas, which says, "What does it mean to write poetry? 2 times 2 equals 4 is not yet a poem." But we'll see actually that he was exploring the use of numbers in various of his poems as well. So one of the most direct ways that Švytas engages with the question of metrics and the unruly disruption and imaginative recreation of measure is with the direct incorporation of numbers into his works as compositional means. We can see, for instance, in several of his so-called März collages that include numbers in ways that raise questions of their reference to quantity, order, and value. And this is true also of his multifarious texts, including performance and concrete poems, as well as prose texts such as März poem, The Onion from 1919, which references the numbered chapters of a table of content in the text, or his 1922 allegory of art criticism, also designated a, quote, liver extract, Augusta Bolta, which uses a 1 through 10 number sequence to designate its characters, which also means that numbers have a regular typographical presence in the pages. Numbers, especially ordinal numbers and numbers as quantifiers that depend on ordinal sequences, pervade the work of Schwitters. And in what follows, I'll consider in greater detail how and also why. As to the latter question, why the presence of numbers in Schwitters' work, the artist himself gives us an important clue in his 1926 text entitled Fantastic Thinking. Schwitters here distinguishes between mathematical logic and what he calls human logic, which is grounded in the shifting relationality of the pronouns. And he writes, we humans do not think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, or 2, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 6. Rather, we think I, you, we, you all. Schwitters suggests that there is a mismatch between mathematics and human logics as well, because human thinking is mediated through embodied representation, that is, phenomenologically. If you want to mathematize an ever-changing human reality, Schwitters suggests, for instance, in a formula like 1 equals infinity, or 1 is not equal to 1, you will be writing nonsense. However, he continues, perhaps mathematics itself is nonsense, quote, because we cannot think completely abstractly. Our thinking only makes sense insofar as it is supported by bodily representations. Schwitters thus indicates here his general concern, in the name of human individuality and intersubjectivity, to relativize mathematically rational orders, and also implicitly the corollary bureaucratic rationality that depends on assigning sequential and relational numbers on everything from case files to street trolleys, and capitalist rationality, in which every object is made to bear its value on its face as a number indicating its monetary value. And this is a point that he rather starkly illustrates in his 1935 eye drawing, Zeichnung, which was done from exile in Norway, in which the blood red letters of the first person pronoun, ich, and the blue geometrical form emerge starkly from the brown number-filled background of advertisements and transportation tickets. Schwitters' 1919 watercolor number 1, which is subtitled The Heart Goes from Sugar to Coffee, contains the numbers 6, 9, and 19. In the case of the 6, 9, it may seem to refer to the geometrical angle for which it is a label, and more generally to the compass settings evoked by angles and circular figures in the middle of the watercolor. Yet the angle would seem to be incorrect. It would, contrary-wise, seem to be about 45 degrees and not 69 degrees. I would suggest that the number 6, 9 may represent a numerical analog of Schwitters' palindromic and reversible female hero, Anna Bluma, whose name reads the same backwards and forward, and whose ANNA, Schwitters reminds us with a sly wink, and looks the same backwards and forwards, and we see him picking up in some way the erotic theme that's hinted at the title, The Heart Goes from Sugar to Coffee. The 19 in this case doesn't refer, as it sometimes does in the Merz pictures, to Schwitters' meticulous numbering of the works in series, for instance, Merz 252, but rather an abbreviation of the date of its execution along with the artist's abbreviated signature, his initials KS. So it may be surmised that the work entitled Roman numeral X. Roman numeral X may self-reflexively refer to its date of composition, 1919. So that's actually X May 191, so it's missing the 9. There are also two Merz pictures from 1922, Merz 426 and Merz 459, that bear the title Zahlen, numbers. So that Schwitters is here referring to the concrete presence of the number forms itself is signaled by the lack in the former of any clear reference or function, and in this case, the abstraction of what seems to be highly enlarged segments of number forms that overlap and interleave with one another. So I'd like to dwell at somewhat greater length on this picture, which is entitled Picture with Light Center from 1919, and I'll be showing you some details from this. This Merz picture disposes several different numbers at different scales. So we see the larger black letters 23 and 95 and 94, as well as 20p, perhaps 20 pence or 20 pennies, and Sitz number 20, and the ordinals 2 or second 2, which seem to refer to a theater ticket, the seat and the row of the ticket. In addition, in this work, there's the number 3. Let's see. There's the number 3 printed on one of the collage postal stamps, and numbers that can only be inferred but no longer read on one of the other postage stamps. There's also, very obscure and inverted, the reference to days and months of the calendar that says 31 Tage, 31 days. And lastly, there's Schwitter's own dating of the work, 1919, along with his initials and signature in the overall painting. We would be mistaken in this instance to construe the numbers in Picture with Light Center to be only concrete compositional material, since Schwitters also mobilizes them as references to different conceptual, semiotic, and social ordering systems that pervade three-dimensional spaces, while at the same time allowing these various systems to interfere with one another on the two-dimensional plane of the Merz composition. In one framework of reference, which is a purely pictorial formal one, the numbers conjure up structural elements of painting. As pictorial elements, for instance, they offer inflections of size, relative position on the canvas, distinctness or obscurity of their figure and contour, and layering to suggest in-frontness or behindness of objects as seen from a perspective point of view. Composing these various elements of the number images together coherently might produce the skeleton of a continuous three-dimensional perspectival space, which, as Schwitter's use of numbers slyly alludes, depends on a set of orderly metrical relations on the canvas. Instead, of course, they fail to add up to a continuum, interrupting and interfering with one another and always coming up short and amounting to too much. But going beyond the visual features of numbers as structure and space implying, there are also ways in which the number allude to an open set of semantic fields and social functions, such as advertising, street numbering, the postal system, commodity exchange and money, the theater and/or cinema, and the serial printing of newspapers, advertisements, and graphics. The radial organization of the painting, with its larger circular and lightly colored forms concentrated at its center, and its darker, smaller, rectangular and triangular forms and greater density of small collage details at its peripheries, may suggest the multi-vectoral trajectories of movement and activity within a modern urban space, or alternatively, a head-like shape indicating a desubjectivized eye taking in the various mobile fragments around it. This reading would situate Schwitter's Märzbild within other representations of contemporary urban disorder and complexity, such as Georg Grotz's Metropolis from 1916 to 1917, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's film script, which we've looked at, of Metropolitan Dynamics from 1921 to 22, or Giga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, from which we have this still, which depended on a complex set of metrics applied to the film editing to reflect the circadian rhythm and technological organizational subdivisions of the day that it treats. Schwitters offers us a disordered metropolitan space, but without the anxious expressionism of Grotz. He explores the intervallic relations of urban dynamics like Moholy-Nagy and Vertov, but without their underlying technological rationalism. Numbers function individually in Picture with Light Center as cool and sober markers of the modern city, but together they are rendered disorderly by their being merged together in interpenetrating overlapping sets of human systems, frames of reference, and functional fields. Now, in a text from 1925 called How One Enters a Cinema for Free, we can see Schwitters working analogously to send up, in a parable-like way, the irrationality that arises at the interface, here the in and out of doors of the cinema, between internally rational subsystems of social rules and regulations. And in this short text, Schwitters offers a parody of a kind of communistic utopia in which commodity relations will have been suspended. He plays an absurd game with time and space metrics that suggest metonymically the broader metrical irrationality that pertains in the wider domain of social space in the capitalist city. And I'll read this. In Prague, entrance is Vyshod and exit is Vyshod. The whole difference is only a short I. That gave me occasion to think, and I thought about the concept entrance and exit, and with success. The essential is always the direction of the head. At the entrance, it points inward. At the exit, outward. Good. I asked the doorman of a large cinema in Berlin whether in entering a cinema there is a prescribed speed. He believed that there existed no regulation about that. Good. So, history can also be negative. Accordingly, one must not enter the entrance, but the exit of a cinema if one wants to enter for free. You position yourself facing out with the other lovely part of your body, of course, facing in, and exit with negative speed. No one can thus require anything of you since you are using the exit in the allowed manner. Thus, everyone enters the cinema without paying anything. Good. Now you are standing in the movie house. You aren't permitted to remain standing. The police won't allow it. For the use of a seat in the cinema demands a charge. There only remains to you a choice. Either you must take a place and pay, or you have to go out again. So for a time and a long one axis, the metrical relations of time and space are reversible, and the money economy is elided, not just for the individual, but for everyone. Yet the utopia is soon interrupted again by fixed and numbered seats of the cinema, the police, and the monetized relations of capital. History can also be negative, as Schwitter writes, acknowledges the utopian suspension of time when, as in the Spartacus uprising that shook Germany at the time Schwitters was first conceiving of Merz, the metrics of social existence are turned topsy-turvy in a revolutionary way. In his humorous relation to both the face and the rear end in this text, Schwitter also alludes back to the erotics embodied by his famous Anna Blume that we've already referred to, whose Anna reads the same backwards and forwards. Yet ultimately, Schwitter posits neither forwards nor backwards, positive or negative, revolution or restoration, as the dominant dynamic of his artistic thought world, but rather the intermittence, interruption, and the decisional crossroads of crisis. Either you must take a place and pay, or you have to go out again, that this kind of complexity implies. Now turning more or less in conclusion, last few minutes of this, to his concrete poetry, I'd like to look at a few examples such as poem 25, Elemental from 1922, and the 1923 untitled poem, which begins with the first line 1710, as well as the poem 12, which I will come back to a moment in the to this latter poem. But I'd like to turn briefly to an example in which the number system interacts and is contextualized by other systems such as letters, words, and grammar. And this poem is called the AA Bildgedicht, or the AA image poem from 1922, where we have 6 times 4 6 times by 4 L-shaped bracket and 2 additional boxes, one of which is 2 times 2 and the other which is 1 times 2. And if you, as you can see from the way that I've described it, there are mathematically ordered relations that are inscribed into the graphic figure. Then we have letters and numbers that are dispersed across and outside of the gridded box. These include 3 A's, including 1 double-sized letter, 2 number 1s, 2 M's and N's, and 1 S. So if we were to take the boxed figure as a sort of Cartesian coordinate system, we could map the position of the letters. For instance, the first A would correspond to 1, 6. The 2 number 1s would be -1, 2, and +1, 2, and so on. The lower left-hand N might be 2, 2, 3, and the large A might be 2, 3, 4, 5. However, other ordering systems come into play, such as the fact that an, ans, and am are directional and positional prepositions in German relative to the dispositions and movements of bodies in space, meaning onto and upon. And below, in and S together make the compound, I'm not sure if I can say this, but ins, which might be taken as a fragment of the word eins, which is the number signified by 1. In this sense, we are tempted to read the 2 number 1s as substituting for the 2 missing letters E and I. However, the implied word eins, meaning the number 1, could also be read as ein S, the only letter of which there is indeed only 1 in this poem. All right, we can see that despite this very spare construction, Schwitters creates a dense web of suggestive but unresolvable formal interconnections between its elements. But what is this rigmarole really all about? We can't really say for certain what the intention of it is. But to take one further speculative step, recalling Schwitter's interruption of mathematical order by the phenomenological orders of the body and its movements, we might remark that the title AA is not only a reference to the opening line of the poem, but it's also child's talk in German for Kaka, or feces. The prepositional contractions ans and am might then imply something like a body going down ans Klo, on the toilet, or sitting on the toilet, and going to the toilet, sitting on the toilet. Moreover, a phonetical performance of the poem, as would be quite in character for the humorist Schwitters, may reveal a childish and scatological subtext in the poem, mimicking the sound of a defecating person, as scornfully pooping on the attempt to discipline and order the Merz or Merz-producing body. It's also possible to read in the poem as referring once again to Anna, as in Anna Bloom, with the M's perhaps forming Mama and by implication Dada. In this regard, we might see in the strange grid the abstract profile of a seated woman with her legs outstretched, a large bust, and the singular S representing the heel of her woman's shoe. And again, quite within character of Schwitter's play with this kind of figural language. Now, we may see a similar disruptive modalization of number in Schwitte's 1922 poem, Zwölf, 12, which is also associated with erotics. Schwitte's arrangement suggests the rises and falls of excitation, which performance can heighten as the sequence of numbers intermittently rises as high as 11 and then falls back to the slope of numbers to 1 without the putative goal 12 being pronounced, either comically suggesting a kind of premature climax or a peak in which the goal is ecstatically achieved but is only retrospectively speakable through a token of language, with the number word 12 that appears only in the title as the summation of it all. So I'm going to read this in a way that I heard the neo-avant-garde poet Gerhard Rühm from Austria read this particular poem, and I think it actually does capture potentially this erotic subtext of Schwitte's. So, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's counting up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 8, 1, 9, 1, 10, 1, 11, 1, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, in conclusion, I want to refer to a very curious text by Schwitte's. I won't go into it in great detail, but this is from 1927, in which he proposes an alternative number system based on 12 and a orthographics of numbers corresponding to this system. Notably, in what would be the number 12, in Schwitte's number system, is the turning point, which is represented by the maximum fundamental ordinal 11 being reached, and 12 being represented by the fusion of 1 and 0. 13 is then 1, 1, 14 is 1, 2, and so on up to 24, which is represented as 2, 0. One might suspect that this number system and symbolism might be inflected with a bit of the erotic play that drove the poem 12, which I just read, which after all rises steadily towards 11 and then falls back to the 1, 0 of the ending that signifies the title number 12 in Schwitte's alternative mathematics. But this doesn't answer the still more basic question, why 12? Why is the juncture of 0 and 1, the binary start of all ordinal numbering, recurrent at 12? Since after all, the same erotic implication could have been created with any number as the goal, say 9 or the decimal 10. I would suggest, though I don't have further time to expound this, that an answer lies with Schwitte's and more broadly the avant-garde's concern with temporality, with cross-currents of qualitative time that disrupt the 12-numbered hours of the modern clock, which are metered to the pulse of exaltation, fear, injury, sexual desire, bodily urge and need, and on the collective scale, the chaotic movement of crowds, their massing and dispersion, and their galvanizing to revolt and revolution. Schwitte's recognized that life couldn't be lived just by the numbers, especially by the orderly procession from hour to hour, according to the measure of the clock or year to year in the form of the historical chronology. But the numbers could be turned and bent to the unruly human logics that govern our individual and collective lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyrus, for this immensely rich and fascinating talk. You have guided us through the kind of essence of these two very different but also mutually enlightening artist of the historical avant-garde period, which allows us to, get a very quick grasp of what was happening in those days, and how what they did actually are closely connected to what we are experiencing as life and art in our contemporary times. And I'm especially happy about having you give us this talk, because on this particular campus, we rarely we rarely have talks dealing with such subjects. Maybe on the campuses of our university, of a few of our University of Arts, it's more common. But here it's a rare treat. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
any questions from the floor? Yeah, Mr. Huang. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, Professor Miller. Thank you for the talk. And my question is that is there a parallel to be observed between Lev Manovich's idea of a database logic and the narrative logic, between Mahalanobis's idea of simultaneity versus sequentiality, and also Swift's idea of human logic and mathematical logic? Is there a parallel to be observed over there?
I would say that there is a parallel in a couple of senses. I think Moholy-Nagy was very much exploring in a pre-digital mode some of the implications of technology that also are picked up and intensified and remediated when we get to the digital mode. Also, from a conceptual point of view, and this is with regard to Lev Manovich's work, as you may know from his work on the language of new media, he very explicitly translated the, let's say, the inherited language of art criticism and art history into digital terms. And I think that that between these two things, this perhaps precursor relation of Moholy-Nagy and Lev Manovich's explicit recasting of the language of art criticism from the digital perspective, we can see a relationship between them. And Moholy-Nagy was a very active theorist and pedagogue as well. So he was involved with developing a kind of system that he taught within the Bauhaus, and then in the new Bauhaus when he was in exile in the United States after the in the late 1930s and 40s as well. So he also was working to try to put his insights into a teachable, theoretical, and pedagogical form as well.
Okay, any other questions? Tyrus, if I may, there's for the time being, there's no questions yet from the floor. No other questions yet. May I ask you a question?
Oh, yes.
Concerning, what Peter Bürger said about the avant-garde's failure and its actually kind of unintended reflections on the institution of art. How that reflection of the institution of art is manifested respectively in these two artists. I mean, I think you touched upon that. Can you maybe elaborate on that point more systematically? Thank you.
Yeah. So, let me think of how to. So the Peter Berger argument that I think is, what people typically focus on is the idea of the overcoming of the autonomy of art in the practice of the avant-garde, and an orientation of art activity towards an intervention in and a transformation in a broader set of life worlds. And I think that we certainly can see that in the aspirations of both Moholy Nagy's work and in Kurt Schwitte's. One manifestation of that is this engagement with, on Moholy Nagy's case, with technologies, and a broad range, not simply art making technologies, but also the mechanization and mobilization of the urban environment, for instance. And he does see his artistic activity as oriented towards that larger transformation of life that is taking place through technology and modernization. In the case of Schwitte's, it's the deflation of traditional art materials. He's he paints and he makes sculptures and so forth, but often with materials that are literally the detritus of everyday life: tram tickets, theater tickets, advertisements, newspapers. And he applied this in a vast range of practices, including even up to a certain kind of notion of architecture. His own house was an object of collage, where he built essentially kinds of collage caves and spires, called the Märzbau, or also he referred to it as the Cathedral of Erotic Misery. So he saw this collage practice really as pertaining to a very broad range of everyday life, just as he was drawing upon that for the materials. And in that way, not seeing art as an autonomous activity with its kind of special domain, but as a practice of life.
Can we say in very rough terms that in the case of Moholy Nagy, it's more like the foregrounding of the materiality of technology, whereas in the case of Schwitte, it's the collage of detritus of modern living, modern urban living. So
yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good characterization of their basic orientation. Although I think actually one thing that I would say that they have in common, very different approaches otherwise, but what they have in common is a certain kind of bypassing of, let's say, the spiritual dimension that was traditionally associated with art, and a reorientation towards a set of direct relations with materiality. So that picture that I showed of the eye image, the eye picture, that's a case where it's a common theme both in this sort of more mechanistically oriented art as well as Dadaism, that human cognition and human subjectivity is now being remade by a set of material impacts and relations to the material world. And it had the dimension of, I mean, if we think about this work as coming out in the context of almost a sort of religious sacralization of art by the expressionist, we can see that this was a counter gesture to that sort of idealization. Very different, plays out in very different ways in Moholy Nagy and Schwitte's, but I think both of them are really reorienting towards these direct interactions and impacts of materials.
Thanks a lot for this. For this supplementary remark. Thank you. Any other questions? questions from the online audience? No. Okay. We have some, I believe, graduate students from from this particular university or maybe other campuses. Would you like to have a dialogue with our speaker? Any questions? It's a great opportunity to be able to converse face to face with Professor Tyrus Miller, who is a very renowned scholar in the study of modernism and avant-garde art. This lady in the back, you're probably a professor. No questions from our students here? Or? Okay, then maybe I should. Actually, I have more questions for you. So before they come up with other questions, let me maybe ask you one other question. I mean, I'm glad that you just mentioned that the point about spiritualization or the subjectification, and so my question, my second question would be, how do these two artists actually conceive of what they believe to be authentic experience, or perhaps they didn't think that there was any authentic experience. I mean, this is kind of a idea that Walter Benjamin was very concerned about. So what do you think?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. I actually do think that there is a notion of authenticity, and it's related to this despiritualization. I think that they would be seeing a kind of false idealization of this metropolitan experience, just to give a shorthand, as a kind of inauthenticity, and consequently as a corollary, a kind of openness and engagement with the actual environments that they find themselves in, and that is a environment that is structured by all of these kinds of by this complexity, by this disparateness, by this presence of a kind of effective and impactful materiality. They would, in some sense, see that as the basis of an authenticity. So, I mean, Schwitters was, for instance, very autobiographical in many of his writings, but in a way where these various things function in the autobiography. He will use the term März, meaning his kind of procedure of collage, also as his own proper name. So he's suggesting that his own life is a kind of collage composed of these, of these different materials. And I think that also was in play in this very individual, maybe even psychoanalytically oriented dwelling that he created of this Märzball, which, as I said, he subtitles that the Cathedral of Erotic Misery, with the suggestion that there are some very personal relations and matters and desires and frustrations that he's working out in this construction. So it's that very strange relationship between a kind of willingness to objectify and externalize in these materials, but without the claim of there being an absence of the I. It's that the I and subjectivity is now expressed in a new relationship to this materiality. And it's very much turned against, as I said, I would say the traditions that preceded it of symbolism and of expressionism, where there's an evocation of some sort of unique interiority that is highly spiritualized and highly idealized. This is both of them in various ways are artists that sort of turn that subjectivity outward and, you know, see the outer world and interaction with it as, you know, the place where that subjectivity is being reworked and expressed.
Well, great. I'm glad that you mentioned psychoanalysis. I mean that's probably one of appropriate approach to attack this phenomenon, because you know Lacanian psychoanalysis or even Freudian psychoanalysis construe the human being as split already, right? And Lacan even exteriorize the so-called subjectivity, and so yeah, in a word, maybe we can say for them, the inauthenticity becomes authenticity to a certain extent. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I agree with that in the sense that, obviously both Freud and Lacan looked to, especially the symbolic activity of language as being the place where subjectivity resides. And also, this question of authenticity is really at play in this question of desire that I think is also a part of certainly Shveta's. I mean, Mahoy Naj, it's a somewhat more complicated question, but in Shveta's, the question of love, of sexual desire, of, kind of bodily urges is one of the factors that sort of disaggregates and disorders, sort of neat symbolic relations. And there's a certain kind of relationship to Lacan's insight as well, where the subject wants to construct itself as a sort of, closed symbolic system, but is constantly having that foiled in various ways and disrupted and disordered.
Right. Thank you. You guys can ask questions in Chinese. We can translate for you. Is that one from the online audience? Can I have that? Taras, there's a question from our online audience. Okay, chat here. I think it's from one of our faculty, Manuel. He says, can you read this?
Yes.
Okay. Let me read it out. Your reading of Shveta's number poems made me think of how today we approach crossword puzzles, sudokus, and cryptograms and the like, which we often encounter embedded in other media like the newspaper. We treat these not as artistic statements, but as games or mind challenges designed to entertain or distract us from the distressing news we just read. Do you see Shveta's opening up a new way for us to rethink the role of crosswords and other word puzzles today?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and the surprising one to me. I hadn't really considered this particular issue, but I would say that one piece of it is that Shveta's, in making what he would call poetry, was exploring the relationship to various sorts of genres, children's songs, advertising, and also I think that you're correct in seeing him drawing upon crossword puzzles and so forth and perceiving them as potentially a poetic means, but obviously not an elevated poetry, but a everyday poetry and a, a somewhat disenchanted or de-idealized poetry. So your question is also asking reciprocally, I think, is asking us reciprocally if we can see after Shvitas a certain kind of everyday artfulness in these various forms of popular culture or media culture. And I do think that's part of the work that the avant-garde did was to allow us to see various kinds of elements of everyday life. If it's, in some ways sort of blurring the distinction between everyday life and art practices, it's also allowing us as we go about in our everyday life to perceive certain kinds of events or objects through the lens of an artistic or an aesthetic perception. And I would also say that there's an analogous thing here in someone like the work of the composer John Cage, who was breaking down the distinctions between musical sounds and the broader realm of sound and noise. And again, if we are attuned to certain kinds of aspects of electronic music or of Cage's work, we can perceive in our environment some things that we previously wouldn't have thought of as musical, but we're able to tune into them and perceive them in a different way. And I don't think we would claim that I don't know, a truck going by is a high musical composition, but we can listen to it and begin to hear pitches or begin to hear a rhythmic pattern that we might not have been attuned to prior to engaging with this musical work. So I think, to come back to Shvitas, I think that was something that Shvitas' work was oriented towards, which was really to say, look all around us. Look at my work is telling us that all around us there are elements that we can also perceive aesthetically or we can perceive artistically without having to make the claim that this is art with a capital A. And one other thing that I would say that's, again, a little bit analogous to this question is that Shvitas, along with other artists like Marcel Duchamp, where they're using image material, they're pointing to the fact that artists made these. So if there's a picture of something in an advertisement, this may not be a high artist. It's not an artist who is working, is displaying in a gallery, but these are image materials that were created by a graphic designer or a commercial artist. And he's in some sense kind of including and inviting a collaboration with these artworks that are out in our everyday life and bringing them into his work, but implicitly also establishing a relationship with those anonymous artists. So he may be saying something like, the composer of a cryptogram or a crossword puzzle. I think I could hear him, sort of asserting that these are anonymous poets as well, and I'm inviting that relationship with them.
Taras, can I pursue this a bit further? It seems that, this kind of art is usually called, or approach to art usually called l'art trouvé, right? Found art, and it implies the concept of art trouvé seems to imply that this is art found by the artist, by the avant-garde artist. So there's still a sense of the artist being the central figure in the avant-garde art. Is that kind of a paradox? Because they're not. It seems to me they're not actually implying that these images were created by anonymous artists. Rather, they could be material for art, as long as I the avant-garde artists found it, right? Like the fountain. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like a paradox.
there is a certain paradox in that. I mean, I think that there is a genuine democratizing gesture, that you know, sort of the claim that my 6-year-old could make this, or you know, anyone could do this. I think in some cases is actually accepted by the artist of the avant-garde, not in, you know, not in a literal sense, but to say, yes, this is a kind of work that can be done. That said, I do think that there is, I mean, there's an incredible attention and skill in Kurt Schwitt's collage as well. These are not just casual paste anything to the canvas. They're carefully composed, but again, utilizing these materials which are coming from a humble realm. So it's less a kind of completely anti-art gesture or something that the artist disappears, but the artist is repositioned with respect to that, you know, that both the democratic realm and with respect to the humbleness of the materials that they're working on.
We got another question from our online audience. You state that in the artistic works and thought, both Naj and Schwitters offer alternative models for contemporary appropriation of the past that emphasize complexity, remediation of the past, and freedom from traditional authority, while not being just ahistorically futuristic. I wonder what you think the work can tell us about current fascinations with Black, Indigenous, and other futurisms as a way of imagining alternative futures, often by reimagining the past. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you know, one thing that I would say is I think that these forms of, let's say, counterfactual histories, or you know, Afrofuturisms and so forth, they are authentically in the tradition of the avant-garde, and I think that they are that in many cases the practitioners of these various forms are knowing revisionary readers of an avant-garde tradition. So there obviously this has taken on a life of its own. I don't want to sort of claim in any way that they're at this point dependent on that prior relation of the avant-garde, but I do see certain of the artists being quite conscious of reaching back into a tradition that I guess what I would see as the essential point is a freeing of the relationship between the work that they're producing and a history as it's given, the ability to actually artistically reconfigure and in some ways manipulate the history in order to generate alternatives and to imagine alternatives that wouldn't be dependent on simply accepting a hegemonic history. I do think that is probably the authentic avant-garde legacy in these various, as you say, Black, Indigenous, other futurisms.
And some from our online audience or the audience at the venue. You can ask in Chinese and we can translate for you. Okay, Tyrus, can I pursue this a bit further? I mean, I think this was a great question, and the European historical avant-garde artists were reacting against a very strong dominant um, artistic as well as cultural tradition in the world, right? So it's the tradition at the time of their revolt. It was dominant all over the world already, right? So in that sense, they are reacting against a sort of um, very very powerful tradition, which they had actually little hope of reforming or remediating it. Yeah. But in the case of American Black or Indigenous people, all Indigenous people here, for instance, their traditions are in a very very tattered situation. They're endangered basically, and so I'm more interested in part about while not being historically futuristic, how can they actually, by more or less challenging their traditions, recreate or produce alternative possibilities which would not at the same time further eroding their traditions. So that's a kind of a double bind situation for the indigenous people especially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So any advice from you?
I don't know if I can give advice.
Oh, American Indians. We can talk about American Indians.
Yeah, I feel more comfortable with talking about forms of Black avant-gardism and because I think that there are a number of notable examples that we can point to and different phases of the Black avant-garde. So one moment that we can really look at as at least encompassing a Black avant-garde is during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. So there is a corollary avant-garde and modernistic movement that is specifically African American and is at least in part recapturing both various kinds of folk traditions and historical materials, but put in the service of innovative new kinds of work, and in other cases is also involved in in a different perspective on the way in which non-Western and especially African arts are feeding into the crisis in culture in the European centers and also in the avant-garde innovation that is taking place, to claim a different perspective on those sorts of movements. So that's a kind of an early instance. I would also say that in the case of a really manifestly Black avant-garde that you see, for instance, in free jazz in the 1960s, you see a very strong interest in world musics, but especially African-based musics and techniques that, when introduced into the jazz context, were highly innovative. These aren't to be mistaken for traditional musics, but by looking to both past forms and also geographically and culturally specifically Black forms, that they're creating this kind of musical innovation. I would also say it's a place where we can see a certain kind of Black sort of Afrofuturism being born. So Sun Ra, his work where there's a kind of mythology that he propagated of, that he came from Saturn and he came to Earth, and it provided him a kind of satirical, critical perspective on white society and also, the creation of an individual mythology. There is the cooperation of Leroy Jones, Mary Baraka with Sun Ra in a play called The Black Mass that is a sort of a Frankenstein type story of a mad scientist, but it's a mad scientist who is creating the white race, a black mad scientist who's creating the white race. So you can see these ways in which the work of this this African American avant-garde is also reaching towards what we can see now as an early form of Afrofuturism. So again, I don't know that I have I don't know that I have advice about this, but I think that the avant-garde legitimated looking for alternative traditions and legitimated the reconfiguration of them in ways that served our artistic and cultural innovation and contestation.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from our online audience. The title of Remediating the Future reminds me of a quote from 1984 by George Orwell. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. I'd like to know your opinion on NFTs, and does it carry the intrinsic value from the avant-garde?
Yeah, I think there's probably two remarks or two questions in there, and one has to do with how do we distinguish what might be a sort of free play or kind of contestation of histories, alternative histories, from its mere falsification. Orwell is referring to a rewriting of history that was, for instance, the case in Stalinist Russia. So it's a very provocative question, because I mean, one answer that I have is I don't know how you, in some definitive sense, draw a strict line. I do think that the intentions of the avant-garde to first of all, to contest certain specific hegemonic historical discourses is an important part of that distinction, whereas what Orwell was really identifying was this falsification of history in the service of hegemonic power. I don't know that that when we're in the realm of history that we have any guarantees that we have to, but I also think that the avant-garde, one of the things that we would say about the avant-garde is we don't mistake it for a discourse that from the outset presents itself as truth. It presents itself as an artistic critical perspective on that which claims it's to be truth. Whereas the falsification of history that Orwell was talking about was, again, something that immediately put itself forward as a falsified truth. With respect to NFTs, I don't have a really strongly formed opinion about them, but I do think that they're in some ways become a kind of corollary of cryptocurrency, and they're so strongly tied in with the financialization of society. It's hard for me to see them really as carrying a lot of avant-garde weight. That said, it's a little bit like the opening up of it feels a little bit more to me like day trading of stocks online. There is a certain kind of democratization where more people have access to the stock market than previously had. And I think the creation of NFTs and the trading in NFTs, does represent that sort of broadening of the possibility of engaging in that kind of market. But I'm very suspicious of the degree to which it's just a alternative form of financialization. So I don't necessarily see it as carrying a whole lot of the valence of the avant-garde.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, concerning the part about falsification of history, maybe we can say that the avant-gardist, attempt was precisely to reveal the falsification of history by capitalist modernity or bourgeois modernity. Okay? And what they actually was trying to do is to posit, alternative temporalities or futures which would not be weighed down by the monolithic capitalist configuration of history or temporality.
Yeah, I would agree with that formulation. There's an explicitly critical intent. So and in many ways, it's more negative than constructing an alternative reality or an alternative history.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, hello, Professor Miller. I have another question that is specifically regarding the NFTs. And what I found interesting about the NFT is that is the NFT and also its relation to Walter Benjamin's concept of aura. It's kind of represent using a procedurally generated way to find a procedural representation of aura. So would you say that in a way it's kind of also remediant in the past in that it is attempting to procedurally generate an old idea or a concept of art or a kind of a characteristic that art should have in a way?
If I've understood your question, I would agree with your connection of the NFT with the aura, and basically a kind of reconstitution in a digital environment through kind of particular procedures of reinventing the singularity and the originality of the artwork. Now, it didn't require the digital environment for that to be the case. We know the examples of things like monoprints, limited editions of photographs and videos. You go into an art gallery and you see a William Kentridge animated film. If you have enough money, you can buy one of 5 DVD copies of that animated film. The fact that there are 5 as opposed to 5,000 or 5 million is really a product of the gallery system and the sort of social relations of the system, rather than something that's intrinsic to the technical medium. And I think that the NFTs have recognized that and generalized it to the most dematerialized form of the artwork being granted a kind of singularity and individuality that we think of as really coming from the past, coming from the art forms of the past. So I would agree with your connection there that this does represent a certain kind of reinvention of characteristics of past art forms paradoxically in the digital medium.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. There's another question from our online audience. Thanks for your sharing. Let me know more about Schwitters and Moholy-Nagy. I am curious that if Kurt Schwitters and Moholy-Nagy have ever been affected by Eastern culture in their art, like John Cage, who has been influenced by Zen.
The milieu that they were in, so for instance, Moholy-Nagy was in the Bauhaus. There was a great deal of interest in Eastern religions, but not by Moholy-Nagy. Moholy-Nagy was very resolutely secular, and I would say also oriented in a kind of Western way towards technology. Schwitters as well, but there was at that time, as part of a kind of, let's say, modern or counter-modern orientation, a great deal of interest in Buddhism, in various forms of Eastern religion. I would just say that Shvitas and Mohoinaj were probably not particularly influenced by that.
Thank you very much, Tyrus. Any questions? Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we have like maybe exhausted Sir Miller already. So I just like to thank you again on behalf of our institute and our university for this very, very enlightening talk. I personally also learned a lot from you, and I enjoy very much the conversation that followed the talk. But of course, if there's other opportunities, I like to, I have a longer conversation with you on many, many other issues. But today, I guess we should call it the day at this point. And thank you again for everything. And let's stay in touch. And hopefully, very soon we can meet in person.
I look forward to that. And
Okay.
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and also for the conversation that we've had after the talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll
Right.